firewood was still there. Florence Turner stood in the doorway of her dying homestead, the January wind cutting through the thin wool of her shawl like a blade honed on hatred, and she stared at the neatly stacked logs on her porch as though they were an accusation. Her breath came in short, visible bursts. Her hands shook. Not from the cold, though God knew the cold was brutal enough to break lesser women, but from the realization that had just detonated inside her chest like a charge of black powder. She had found out the truth, all those mornings. Every single morning for 3 months, she had woken before the pale light even touched the Kansas plains, and she had found the firewood there. She had told herself it was charity. She had told herself it was the town showing pity to the widow too stubborn to leave. She had even, in her darker moments, told herself it was some kind of trap laid by men who wanted her land and were softening her up for the kill. She had never once allowed herself to believe it was him, Charles Garrison. The man who had not spoken more than 14 words to her in the 6 months she had lived in Harlan Creek. The man whose eyes she had caught watching her from across the mercantile with an expression so carefully guarded it could have meant anything or nothing at all. The man who owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties and who had a dark past that the town spoke about in whispers. They stopped the moment they saw her coming. And now Millie Dawes, who ran the post office and possessed absolutely no capacity for keeping secrets, had let it slip. Casually. Brutally casually. "Oh, I figured you knew it was Garrison doing it. He is out there before sunup every single morning, Florence. Has been since the first frost hit." Florence's world had tilted on its axis. Because she had spent the last 2 weeks convincing herself she despised Charles Garrison. She had spent those 2 weeks nursing a wound that felt like the worst kind of betrayal, the betrayal of hope. She had believed, stupidly, desperately believed, that maybe someone in this brutal, indifferent territory cared about her survival. And then she had discovered that Garrison had spoken to Judge Harlan about her homestead claim. She had heard it secondhand, ugly and distorted. That Garrison had raised questions about whether a widow alone could properly work the land, that he had suggested it might revert. She had built him into a villain in her mind. It had been so much easier than the alternative, and now the firewood sat there like a confession she did not know how to read. Florence pressed one hand flat against the doorframe. The wood was cold and rough under her palm. She looked out at the snow-covered distance, at the white expanse of Kansas winter that went on until it became the sky, and she thought about what kind of man stacks firewood in secret for a woman he supposedly wants to see fail. She thought about what kind of woman she had become, so accustomed to loss and betrayal that she had turned an act of quiet devotion into evidence of dark motives. Her husband, Robert Turner, had died of typhoid fever in September, 2 weeks after they had arrived in Harlan Creek with everything they owned loaded into a single covered wagon. He had been 31 years old. They had been married 4 years. She had been 26 years old, alone in a territory that did not forgive weakness, with a land claim she barely understood, a homestead that needed work she did not know how to do, and a winter coming on fast and merciless. She had refused to leave. Everyone had told her to leave. Her late husband's brother had written from Ohio and told her to come home. The women at the church in town had gently suggested that a woman alone on a frontier claim was not a practical proposition. Even Reverend Mills had taken her hand between both of his and said that God understood when circumstances demanded retreat. Florence had smiled at all of them and thanked them and stayed. She had stayed because Robert had believed in this land, because leaving felt like abandoning something sacred. Because, if she was being entirely honest with herself in the cold and the loneliness, she had nowhere else to go that felt like forward motion. Ohio meant going backward. This frozen, unforgiving patch of Kansas meant going forward, even if forward was terrifying. But she had not counted on the cold. The first frost had arrived in late October, and the temperature had dropped with a viciousness that felt personal. Florence had a small stove inside the homestead and a modest woodpile that Robert had started before he got sick. She had cut what she could herself, but she was not skilled with an axe, and the wood she managed was uneven and burned badly. By early November she had looked at her diminishing supply and understood with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the weather that she might not make it through January. She had not told anyone. Pride was a complicated and sometimes dangerous thing, but it was one of the few things she had left entirely her own. The morning of November the 4th, she had opened her door to fetch in the last of her wood and found a fresh stack twice the size of what she had remaining. Neat, split cleanly, good, seasoned hardwood that would burn long and hot. She had looked at it for a full minute, trying to understand. She had looked out across the white fields in every direction and seen no one. She had brought the wood inside, and she had wept just briefly, just enough to let the relief out, and then she had made herself stop. The next morning, more wood had been there. And the morning after that. Every single morning, without fail, without variation, a supply of firewood appeared at her door before she woke. She began rising earlier, driven by a mixture of gratitude and a desperate need to know who to thank. But whoever it was had the timing of a ghost. The wood was simply there, and the person who left it was simply gone, and there were only boot prints in the snow that the next snowfall always erased. Florence had asked around, carefully, trying not to seem as desperately curious as she was. The blacksmith had shrugged. Old Denton at the livery had said he hadn't seen anything unusual. Millie Dawes at the post office had seemed flustered in a way Florence had not thought to press. And then the rumor had reached her about Charles Garrison and the land claim question, and she had decided she knew enough. She had constructed a story in her mind in which the firewood was a manipulation, some calculated show of generosity designed to make her feel obligated, to make her trust a man who was quietly working to take everything from her. She had been furious. She had been certain. She was standing now in her doorway in the bitter January cold, looking at neatly stacked hardwood, and she was not certain of anything at all. The question about the land claim. She needed to understand that. She needed to hear it from someone reliable before she decided anything else about Charles Garrison, because Florence Turner had learned the hardest possible way that second-hand information in a small frontier town was frequently a mangled, mistaken, or deliberately distorted version of something else entirely. She would go to Judge Harlan herself. She dressed in her warmest things, the heavy wool coat she had bought from the mercantile using the last of her savings, the thick leather boots Robert had insisted on purchasing in St. Louis before they headed west, and she hitched her mare, a steady chestnut named Clara, to the small wagon. The cold hit her face like a slap the moment she stepped off the porch. She drove the 2 miles into Harlan Creek with her jaw set and her eyes forward. Judge Harlan received her in his office above the hardware store with the slightly startled expression of a man who had not expected to be confronted before 10 in the morning. He was in his 60s, a heavy man with a thick gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades mediating disputes between people who all believed they were entirely right. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "please sit down." "I would rather stand if you don't mind," Florence said. "I heard something recently that concerned me. I heard that there was a question raised about my homestead claim, about whether a woman alone can maintain it legally under the Homestead Act." Judge Harlan's heavy eyebrows rose. "Where did you hear that?" "That's not important right now. Is it true?" He folded his hands on his desk. "There was a conversation. Yes. Someone raised a concern, not a formal challenge, Mrs. Turner. Nothing legal was filed. A concern was raised that a woman in your situation, without a working partner, might struggle to meet the improvement requirements by the end of the claim period." Florence felt the cold again, despite the wood stove burning in the corner of the office. And what was the purpose of raising that concern? The purpose, Judge Harlan said, and now he looked at her with something that might have been respect, was to ask me whether the county had any resources or assistance available that might help you meet those requirements. The concern was not about taking your land, Mrs. Turner. It was about ensuring you could keep it. The silence in the room was enormous. "Who raised the concern?" Florence asked, though she already knew. "Charles Garrison," the judge said. He asked whether there was a way to formally extend the assessment period for claim holders who had experienced the loss of a working partner through illness or death. He was not the first person to raise that question. It has been an issue across the territory, but he was the one who raised it specifically in relation to your situation. Florence stood very still. Outside the window, the January wind pressed against the glass and moaned softly. "He was trying to protect my claim," she said. "Not a question, a reckoning. That was my understanding of his intent, yes." She thanked the judge. She walked back down the stairs and out into the cold and stood beside her mare for a long moment, one gloved hand on Clara's warm neck. The horse turned her head and regarded Florence with the patient, liquid calm that Florence had always found quietly consoling. "I have made a significant error in judgment," Florence told the horse. Clara's breath came out in a great white cloud. Florence drove back toward the homestead with the weight of her own mistake sitting on her chest. She was not, by nature, a person who made accusations she couldn't substantiate. She had not made one, not out loud, not to anyone, but she had made it in her heart, and she had let it sit there long enough to calcify into certainty. She had taken a man who had spent 3 months rising before dawn in brutal winter cold to provide for her survival, who had gone to a judge on her behalf, who had done all of this without a single word of acknowledgement or request for gratitude, and she had decided he was her enemy. The injustice of it burned in her throat. She arrived back at the homestead and sat in her wagon in front of the porch and looked at the firewood and thought about Charles Garrison. What she actually knew about him, stripped of rumor and gossip and the distorted whispers of a small town where boredom made storytellers of everyone. He had come to Harlan Creek 8 years ago, arriving with a small herd and a reputation she could not verify. He had built his cattle operation slowly, and it was now considered one of the finest in the region. He employed 6 men year-round and more during the drives. He was known to pay a fair wage and to keep his word in business dealings. He attended church infrequently but donated generously to the church fund, which Reverend Mills mentioned with a gratitude that suggested the donations were substantial. He was 34 years old, which she knew because Millie Dawes had mentioned it in a context Florence had no longer been paying attention to. He had never married. Had a dark past, that was the phrase everyone used. She had never been able to get specifics because the moment anyone started to tell it, someone else would catch their eye and the story would dissolve into vague deflections. What she had gathered was that something had happened in Texas before he came north, something that people considered either a tragedy or a shame or possibly both. He was silent. That was the most consistent description anyone gave of Charles Garrison, not unfriendly, not cold. Silent, a man who chose his words with a deliberateness that made each one feel significant when it finally came, and who seemed entirely unbothered by the spaces between them. Florence had a sudden, vivid memory of the one extended interaction they had shared. It was the first week of October, 2 weeks after Robert's death, and she had been in the mercantile trying to calculate whether she could afford both seed for spring planting and a replacement axe handle. She had been doing the arithmetic in her head and coming up short and working very hard to keep her face composed. She had reached for a bolt of heavy canvas on the top shelf and it had shifted, and a whole pile of bolts had begun to come down. She had braced herself for the cascade. Instead, a pair of large, steady hands had appeared and caught the whole sliding stack before a single bolt fell. She had turned. Charles Garrison had been standing directly behind her, close enough that she could see the stitching on his dark coat and the particular gray of his eyes, a gray like winter sky just before snow, deep and complicated in a way that did not match the stillness of his face. "Thank you," she had managed. "Yes, ma'am," he had said. 2 words. He had resettled the bolts with practiced efficiency, stepped back and nodded once. And then he had walked to the counter and completed his own business without looking at her again. She had thought about those gray eyes more than she was comfortable admitting. Florence climbed down from the wagon. She brought Clara into the small, lean-to stable Robert had built in September before he got sick, the only structure on the homestead that was properly finished. She gave the mare water and hay and stood for a moment in the slightly warmer dark of the stable. She made a decision. She would go to him. She would go to the Garrison ranch and she would look him in the eyes and she would thank him properly, and she would tell him what she had wrongly believed, because Florence Turner believed that honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, was the foundation of anything worth building. She would go tomorrow. She needed one night to compose herself first. That night she sat by her stove, which burned with the good hardwood he had provided, and she wrote 2 letters. The first was to Robert's brother in Ohio, a brief note saying she was well and intended to stay. The second letter she started 4 times and abandoned, because it was addressed to no one and said things she was not ready to say out loud even to herself. She burned the second letter in the stove. The morning came gray and iron cold. She dressed carefully in her best blouse under her wool coat, which was a vanity she acknowledged and refused to feel ashamed of. She drove Clara and the wagon the 3 miles to the Garrison ranch. The Garrison spread was immediately distinct from every other operation she had seen in the territory. The fencing was in excellent repair, the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of a man who understood that the difference between a good ranch and a failing one was usually the small things done consistently over time. The main house was a solid 2-story structure, not grand but substantial, built from good timber with a proper porch running along the front. There were outbuildings for the bunkhouse and the equipment, and what looked like a very well-constructed barn. One of the hands saw her coming and disappeared toward the barn. By the time she had pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, Charles Garrison had emerged from the barn door, wiping his hands on a cloth, and was walking toward her. In daylight, with nothing between them but cold air and open ground, he was exactly what she remembered and also somehow more. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from physical work rather than display, broad through the shoulders, capable in every movement. His face was weathered and serious, dark with several days of stubble, and his eyes, even at a distance, were that complicated gray. He stopped a respectful 10 feet from the wagon and looked up at her. He said nothing. Florence had prepared a careful speech. It evaporated. "It was you," she said instead. "The firewood every morning." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, he must have known the secret could not hold forever in a town the size of Harlan Creek, but something more complicated, a kind of bracing, as if he was preparing to absorb something. "Yes, ma'am," he said, 2 words, same as in the mercantile, same quiet weight. Florence climbed down from the wagon herself before he could step forward to help, because she needed to be standing on her own 2 feet for this conversation. She faced him on the frozen ground. Up close, the gray eyes were even more difficult. There was something in them she recognized, a particular kind of loneliness that had been lived with long enough to become almost indistinguishable from peace. "I thought it might be a trap," she said. The words cost her something. "I thought you were trying to make me feel obligated so you could then leverage that obligation toward taking the land. I was wrong. I went to Judge Harlan. I know about the conversation you had with him about the claim period." He watched her with an attentiveness that was not aggressive and not passive, something in between alert and careful and patient. "I owe you an apology," Florence said, "and a proper thank you, both of which I am offering now." He was quiet for a long moment. A wind came across the open ground and moved a strand of her hair. She reached up and tucked it back. "No apology needed," Charles Garrison said. "Makes sense, you'd wonder. It does not make sense to assume the worst about someone who has done nothing to earn the assumption. You didn't know it was me doing it. I suspected it was you. I chose to believe the darkest version because," she stopped, "because it was safer," she did not say. "Because hoping for something good and then being wrong is worse than expecting nothing." She did not say that either. He seemed to understand anyway. Something shifted in his face, not quite softening because it was not a soft face but opening slightly, like a shutter turning. "The firewood," she said. "Can I ask why?" He looked at her steadily. "Winter's hard," he said. "Harder alone." Florence looked back at him and thought, this is a man who knows something about that. "Will you come inside?" he asked. "Coffee's on, cold enough to earn a cup." It was such a plain and practical invitation that she found herself agreeing before she had decided to. The inside of the Garrison house was orderly in the way that suggested a man who had strong preferences about his environment, and no one to argue with him about them. Everything was in its place. There were no decorative touches, but the furnishings were good quality and well-maintained, and there were books, more books than she had expected, stacked on a shelf beside the fireplace with the careful attention of someone who valued them. She noticed his hands around the coffee cup when he handed it to her. Large and capable, with a scar along the back of the left one that disappeared under his cuff. "I've been rude to you," she said, sitting at the plain wooden table near the window. "In town, when I thought I was short with you at the Mercantile last week." He sat across the table. "You were civil. I was barely civil." "That's still civil," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor but was related to it, a dry quality. She found herself almost smiling. "The men in town say you have a dark past," Florence said, and then immediately wished she had built toward that more gradually. He did not flinch. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at it for a moment. "They're not wrong," he said. "I'm not asking you to tell me," she said quickly. "That's your business. I only mentioned it because—" She paused, trying to find the right framing. "Because I want you to know that I don't make decisions about people based on what other people say about them. I've clearly already demonstrated I make enough wrong decisions based on my own assumptions without needing help from town gossip." His eyes came up to hers again. "My wife died," he said, "in Texas, 7 years ago." Florence went very still. "There was a fire," he said. The words came out level and controlled, and she understood that the control was the result of long, hard practice. "On the ranch where I worked. I was not where I should have been. I wasn't there when she needed me." "Charles," Florence said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she heard it land differently than she had intended, not formal, not carefully distanced, but something warmer and more immediate. He looked at her. "You have spent 7 years believing that was your fault," she said. "It was my fault." "Did you start the fire?" A pause. "No." "Did you know it would happen?" "No." "Then it was a tragedy," Florence said. "It was not your fault." The lines around his eyes deepened. She could see that no one had said this to him in terms he could accept, and she could also see that he was not quite ready to accept it from her either. But she had said it. She would let it sit wherever it needed to sit. They talked for 2 hours. It startled her afterward how naturally the time had passed. He was not a man who talked for the pleasure of hearing himself. Every word he offered was considered, genuine, and worth the wait, but he was also not as silent as his reputation had suggested. In the right circumstances, with the right person, apparently, Charles Garrison had things to say. He asked about her life before Kansas. She told him about Cincinnati, where she had grown up, the second daughter of a schoolteacher father, and a mother who had made quilts so beautiful they had been displayed at a county fair in 1868. She told him about meeting Robert at a church social, about Robert's dream of the West, about following that dream because she had loved him, and because she had her own dreams about open land and something she could build with her hands. He listened with the particular quality of attention that was his distinctive way, absolute and unhurried, as though nothing else in the world had any prior claim on his time. When she rose to leave, the winter afternoon was already dimming toward gray. She had been there far longer than was probably considered proper for an unmarried woman visiting an unmarried man, and she found that she did not particularly care. "I'll continue bringing the wood," he said at the door. Not a question. A statement delivered with the quiet certainty of someone announcing a decision that was already made. Florence looked at him. She thought about saying she could manage. She thought about the careful arithmetic of pride and survival. She thought about the way he had looked when he said the words "my wife died." 7 years of silence carried in 3 syllables. "Thank you," she said instead. I'd be grateful." She drove back to the homestead in the dimming afternoon with her hands steady on the reins and her mind considerably less ordered than her hands. Over the following 3 weeks, the dynamic shifted. She started leaving the door open when she got up in the mornings. Not wide open, just unlatched, so that the cold draft would reach her wherever she was in the house and she would know when it had come. She began rising at first light, earlier than she had before. The 4th morning after her visit to his ranch, she heard the distinctive sound of split wood being set down on the porch, and she went to the door and opened it. Charles Garrison was crouched at the end of the porch, arranging the last of the morning's stack. He had his back to her. He was wearing his heavy coat and a dark hat dusted with snow, and his breath came up in white clouds as he worked. He moved with a quiet efficiency that had no audience in mind. This was not the movement of a man performing. This was the movement of a man doing what he had decided to do because he had decided to do it. He heard the door and rose and turned. Saw her standing there wrapped in her heavy coat over her nightgown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. He said nothing. She said nothing. The moment sat between them in the cold air, full of something neither of them had a word for yet. "I made biscuits," Florence said at last. "There are enough for 2 if you haven't eaten." His eyes, those complicated gray eyes, held hers for a long beat. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Florence," she corrected. Another beat. "Florence," he said. She stepped back and held the door open, and Charles Garrison came inside. He ate breakfast at her table for the first time that morning, and it was the most natural thing in the world and also the most charged, in the way that simple, ordinary things become charged when they are understood to mean something beyond themselves. They talked while she made coffee, and he sat with his hat on the table in front of him, and his big hands wrapped around the tin cup she gave him while the coffee was still brewing. She found out over the following breakfasts, because he came inside when invited each morning after that he had grown up in Virginia, that he had moved west after the war, that he had read more widely than anyone else she had met in Harlan Creek, that he had opinions about cattle breeding that were both strong and well-reasoned, that he could not bake to save his life but had taught himself to make a passable venison stew, and that he laughed rarely but genuinely, a low, quiet laugh that she found herself working for with a deliberateness she recognized as something new. She found out other things too, more slowly, through the accumulation of small moments. She found out that he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, with the careful attention of a man cataloging something precious. She found out that he noticed things when she was tired, when something was worrying her, when she had accomplished something she was proud of, and that his awareness of these things showed in small adjustments of behavior rather than words. An extra hour spent repairing the lean-to door without being asked. A particular quietness on mornings when she was grieving Robert. He had never known, he told her one morning, quite out of nowhere, how to speak the things he meant. "I can see what matters," he said, staring into his coffee. "I just can't always get it from here." He touched his temple briefly. To here, his hand moved to his chest. "You get there," Florence said. "You just take the long way." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that made her heart do something involuntary. "Yes," he said, "that's about right." It was the middle of February, 6 weeks after her first visit to his ranch, when the frozen ground yielded up the next crisis. One of the Garrison hands, a young man named Pete Sayers, brought word that 3 of Florence's fence posts on the south boundary had been pulled and the wire cut. Someone had been on her property. Charles was at her homestead for breakfast when Pete arrived, and she watched the stillness that came over him at the news. Not anger, or not only anger, but the focused calm of a man shifting into a different kind of attention. "Who's been making noise about that southern quarter?" he asked Florence directly. She thought. "Hiram Beck," she said. "He owns the land adjacent. He made an offer to buy me out in October and I refused." Charles nodded slowly. He looked at the wall for a moment. "Beck's been known to use pressure," he said. "Nothing you can prove, but the pattern's there." "This is my land," Florence said, and there was nothing in her voice except absolute certainty. He looked at her, something in his eyes, a warmth that he did not try to manage in that particular moment. "Yes," he said, "it is." He rode to Beck's property himself, which Florence had not asked him to do. She found out afterward from Pete Sayers, who seemed constitutionally unable to leave out any detail of any story, that Charles had stood in Beck's dooryard and spoken to him in a voice so quiet and so completely unbothered by the possibility of Beck's reaction that Beck had turned a remarkable shade of red and then a remarkable shade of pale, and then invited Charles inside to talk things over. The fence interference stopped. Florence stood with her hands on her hips in the middle of her living room when she heard this and felt something that was equal parts gratitude, irritation, and a warmth she was becoming very familiar with. She waited until the next morning. When he came with the wood and came inside for coffee, she put his cup down in front of him and then sat across the table and said, "You went a Beck." "I did. I didn't ask you to do that." "No," he agreed. "I am capable of defending my own land." "I know you are," he said, with a directness that derailed her prepared speech somewhat. "Then why?" "Because I was angry," he said simply. "And you shouldn't have to fight on every front at once alone. You've got enough to manage already." Florence looked at him. The February light was thin and cold through the window, but it touched his face in a way that made something ache behind her sternum. "Charles," she said quietly, "what are we doing?" He met her eyes. The question had been larger than the words, and he understood that, she could tell. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but I know I don't want to stop." Florence set down her coffee cup very carefully. "Neither do I," she said. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. It was the first deliberate touch between them, and it was so simple, his large scarred hand over her smaller one on the table between their coffee cups in the cold February morning, and it was also enormous. She felt it everywhere. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "There are things I should tell you," he said, "about Texas, more than I said before." "You don't have to." "I want to," he said. "You should know who you're, what I—" He stopped. The words getting lost between thought and tongue the way he had described. He tried again. "I don't want anything between us that you don't know about." Florence turned her hand under his and held it. "Then tell me," she said. He told her. His wife's name had been Margaret. She had been bright and restless and had wanted a different life than the one the Texas ranch offered. He had known this and had buried the knowledge because he loved her and could not face what it implied. He had been away more than he should have been, not unfaithfully, nothing like that, but driven by a need to be useful, to be building something, to be anywhere but sitting still with the uncomfortable truth that his wife was unhappy, and he did not know how to fix it. The fire had started in the kitchen. The hired hand who survived it had told Charles it had been an accident with the stove, a common enough tragedy in that era. Margaret had tried to put it out herself rather than run. It had taken her before anyone could reach her. Charles had arrived home to find the house gone and his wife gone with it, and he had spent the first year after that in a spiral of guilt and whiskey and violence that he was not proud of and did not minimize in the telling. He had hurt people. Not innocents. He was clear about that, with the careful precision of someone who had examined these events many times, but men who had pushed him when he was already past the edge, and he had pushed back with a brutality that scared him in retrospect. He had pulled himself out of it. Slowly, painfully, at considerable cost to his pride and his self-image. He had moved north. He had built something here. He had not let himself want anything beyond the cattle and the land and the work, because wanting felt like standing at the edge of the same drop. Until he had seen Florence Turner in the Mercantile in October, doing mental arithmetic with her chin set against the world, and something in him had simply moved toward her the way water moves toward a slope. Florence listened to all of this with her hand still in his and her eyes on his face. "Margaret's unhappiness was not your fault either," she said when he was done. He made a low sound that was not quite agreement. "People carry their unhappiness inside them," Florence said. "You can love someone fully and still not be able to take it from them. That's the hardest thing to accept, I know." He looked at her. "Robert," he asked. "Robert was happy," she said quickly. "Genuinely, I was trying to be for him for the dream. I loved him truly. But his dream was always more his than mine, and I felt guilty about that, and I never told him. And then he died, and I couldn't tell him, and I had to decide what to do with a dream that was half mine at best. She paused. I've decided to make it fully mine, to take ownership of it completely. Is that terrible? No, Charles said. That's survival. And more than survival. They sat together in the quiet kitchen for a long time after that, and it was the kind of quiet that is not absence but presence, the particular peace of two people who have said hard, true things to each other and found themselves still on solid ground. March arrived and the winter began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The temperatures were still brutal, but the light changed earlier in the mornings, staying longer in the evenings, and the snow on the south-facing slopes began to pull back from the dark earth beneath. Florence could see it happening and felt it like a physical thing, the slow resurrection of the land she had fought through the winter to keep. Charles continued bringing firewood every morning. He had long since stopped pretending there was any neutrality or mere practicality in the act. When she asked him one morning, more gently than she might have asked before, why he had never simply told her, never knocked on the door and said it was from him, he was quiet for a long time. I didn't know how it would be received, he said finally. A widow alone. People already talk in a small town. I didn't want to put you in a position where you felt pressured or like there were conditions attached. Florence looked at him. There were no conditions. Never, he said, and the word came out with a firmness that left no room for doubt. Charles, she said, there is a significant difference between conditions and feelings. You are allowed to have feelings. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she now understood carried 7 years of practiced self-suppression. I know, he said. I'm learning that. She leaned across the small table and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a woman who had made up her mind, which Florence, when she made up her mind, tended to do completely. She felt him go very still for exactly 1 moment, and then he kissed her back with a depth of feeling that answered every question she might have had about his feelings. When they separated, his hands were on her face and his expression was something she had not seen on him before, unguarded, completely unguarded. The quiet, careful man entirely undone and not trying to reassemble himself. Florence, he said, and it was the most he had ever said with a single word. I know, she said. Spring arrived in Harlan Creek with its usual combination of mud and beauty, and the violent optimism that comes after surviving something hard. Florence plowed her first fields in April with help from 2 of Charles's hands, whom he had offered with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to assume what she would accept. She accepted because she was practical about the limits of what one woman could accomplish alone, and because she had decided that accepting help was not the same as being diminished. Charles came with the hands, which had not been part of the original arrangement, and he worked beside her all day without treating it as anything other than work that needed doing. He was good with a plow. She had not expected to find that as attractive as she did. By May, the formal nature of their mornings had dissolved into something more continuous. He came for breakfast most mornings, and on evenings when neither of them had obligations that prevented it, she would drive to his ranch and they would sit on his porch in the warming air and talk, or not talk, in the particular easy companionship they had built over the winter out of firewood and coffee and hard truths. One May evening, sitting on his porch with the last of the light turning the Kansas plains to something close to gold, he said, "I'd like to marry you." It came out exactly the way Charles Garrison delivered most important things, directly, without preamble, in the tone of a man who had thought about this carefully and was now saying it because he was certain. Florence looked at the golden plains. "Is that a question or a statement?" she asked. A brief pause. "Both." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression that was very still and very serious, and underneath the stillness she could see the vulnerability of a man who had stopped protecting himself against wanting something. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his face shifted, not fear, but alertness. "My land is mine," she said. "I will not deed it to you, and I will not merge it into your operation. It is a separate enterprise, and I intend to work it and prove the claim in my own name." "Of course," he said without a moment's hesitation. "I am not easy," she said. "I have opinions about most things, and I am not inclined to keep them to myself." "I had noticed," he said, and there was the quiet humor again, the one she had worked to find and now easily recognized. "And I will not be left behind," she said. "If there are decisions that affect both of us, I expect to be part of making them." "Yes," he said simply. Florence looked at him for a long moment. The man who had stacked firewood at her door every single morning for an entire bitter winter without asking for anything in return. The man who had gone to a judge to protect her land and to a neighbor to stop her fence from being destroyed, and who had never asked for credit for either. The man who had told her the worst things about himself and trusted her with them, and who had looked at her across a breakfast table in February and said, "I don't want to stop." "Then yes," Florence said. "I will marry you." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and the Kansas evening settled around them both with the particular tenderness of a world that had finally relented. They were married in June of 1880 in the Harlan Creek Church, on a day that was blindingly warm and clear. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. Millie Dawes cried loudly and cheerfully in the third pew, and later told everyone she had always known it would happen, a version of events that Florence found completely without factual basis, and found herself unable to fully contradict, because Millie had, after all, been the one to let the truth about the firewood slip. Charles wore his good black coat and stood at the front of the church with the stillness that was his natural mode, and when Florence came down the aisle in her mother's altered cream dress, she had spent 3 weeks taking it in and letting out the hem, he looked at her with an expression that stopped everyone in the church mid-breath. It was not a complicated expression. It was simply a man looking at the thing that mattered most to him in the world openly, without disguising it. Florence held his gaze all the way down the aisle. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, but when it was Charles's turn, he added, unprompted, in the quiet voice that carried perfectly in the hushed church, "And I will never leave you cold." Florence understood exactly what he meant. She pressed her lips together very firmly to prevent the emotion from showing, and then it showed anyway, and she let it. The guests had barely stopped applauding before old Denton from the livery leaned over to his wife and said that he had never expected Charles Garrison to be a man given to poetry, and Mrs. Denton told him firmly that clearly he had not been paying enough attention. The summer of 1880 was a working one, as all summers on the Kansas frontier were. Florence proved her homestead claim with the kind of methodical determination that made the county land office feel vaguely unnecessary. They had records and forms for situations like this, but Florence had everything they could possibly ask for, and several things they had not thought to ask for, and the claim was finalized in August with a satisfying bureaucratic finality. Her name was on the deed, Florence Turner Garrison. She had kept both names deliberately, and Charles had not only understood but had, characteristically, noticed, and said nothing except to nod once with an expression that meant everything. She had planted wheat, and it was growing. She had added chickens to the Lenta stable and was getting eggs with a reliability that made the mornings feel productive in a way that gave her deep satisfaction. She was learning to drive cattle, which she had not anticipated needing to know, and which Charles was teaching her with the same patient, thorough attention he brought to everything. He was, she discovered in marriage, almost exactly the person she had suspected him to be, and also surprising in small ways that accumulated into something wonderful. He woke before her every morning, not only to bring wood, that had been his winter habit, still maintained by force of something deeper than habit now, but because he was a man who liked the early morning quiet and who used it to think. She would sometimes wake to find him already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a book, and the expression on his face in those unobserved moments was one of the most peaceful things she had ever seen. He was patient with her stubbornness when she let it tip into genuine refusal to accept help she needed. He was not passive about it. He would name it, quietly and directly, the way he named everything. But he would do it once and then let the point sit without badgering, because he understood that she needed to arrive at conclusions herself to truly accept them. She was honest with him in ways that she had not known she was capable of with another person. The grief for Robert, which sometimes came at unexpected moments, triggered by a particular slant of light or the smell of the print from a letter. The fear that had lived underneath her stubbornness all winter, the genuine, bone-deep fear that she would not make it, that the cold and the loneliness and the impossible workload would finally tip her past a point she could not come back from. Charles heard all of this without flinching or trying to immediately solve it, which she had not expected and could not have predicted, and which she came to understand was one of the most valuable things another person had ever given her. In September, almost exactly 1 year after Robert's death, Florence realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before telling Charles, partly because she needed to hold it herself first and partly because she was calculating how she felt about it. Not whether she wanted it, which she was surprised to find was not in question, but what it meant for the land and the work and the particular shape of independence she had spent the last year constructing. She told him on a Sunday evening, sitting on the porch of the homestead, she still thought of it as the homestead, distinct from the ranch, even now with the September stars coming out one by one. Charles was very still for a long moment after she told him, longer than usual. She watched his face in the starlight. When he turned to look at her, she saw that his eyes were bright in a way she had only seen once or twice before, the kind of brightness that was not sadness and not joy but something that lived in the territory between them where the deepest things resided. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was, she thought, exactly right. "Perfectly well," she said. "Tired, but well." He nodded. He looked out at the dark prairie for a moment and then back at her. He reached over and put his hand on her face, the way he had in that February moment that had changed everything, and she leaned into it. "I'll be a better father than I was a husband the first time," he said. "You will," Florence said, not as reassurance, as a statement of fact. The winter of 1880 came on with the same brutal force as the one before it, but this year the woodpile at the homestead was enormous, built over summer and fall with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, and Florence and Charles were managing both operations together in the practical, complementary way of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. She moved between both houses as the pregnancy advanced. By December, when the cold was at its worst, she was spending more nights at the ranch house, which was better insulated and had a proper hearth. Charles did not say anything about this arrangement that might have suggested he had wanted it all along, which was one of the small mercies of being married to a man who knew when not to say the thing he was thinking. Their son was born on the 15th of February, 1881, in the upstairs bedroom of the ranch house, delivered by Dr. Calhoun from town, and attended by the calm and terrifyingly competent Mrs. Denton from the livery, who turned out to have assisted at more births than the doctor had, and who took charge with a brisk authority that Charles appeared to find deeply reassuring. Florence found the whole thing considerably harder than she had anticipated and considerably more than she could have hoped for. When it was over and the room was quiet, and she was holding the baby small and dark-haired, and loud in the particular way of someone who had arrived and intended to make his presence known, Charles was sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for a moment that she decided to give him privately. When he raised his head, he was composed, but only barely. "What do you want to call him?" Florence asked. Charles looked at the baby. The baby, as if aware of the scrutiny, turned his face toward the sound of Charles's voice. Something absolutely unmistakable happened in Charles Garrison's face at that moment. "Robert," he said, if you want." Florence looked at him. The man who had understood without being told that honoring the person who had come before was not displacement but completion. "Robert Charles Garrison," she said. Charles nodded, and the composure cracked just enough to let through something she was glad she got to see. Young Robert Garrison was, it was generally agreed within a 30-mile radius of Harlan Creek, an extremely determined child. He had Florence's dark hair and Charles's gray eyes, and what appeared to be both of their stubbornnesses deployed simultaneously, which created interesting situations from the time he could walk. He followed Charles everywhere on the ranch with the seriousness of a person who considered this following to be serious professional preparation. He followed Florence through her fields with the same devoted attention. He fell asleep at the dinner table regularly and had to be carried to bed, a task Charles performed with a gentleness that Florence never grew accustomed to witnessing. Charles had become, as he had promised, and as Florence had stated as fact, exactly the father she had believed he would be. Patient in the deep way, not passive but genuinely, fundamentally patient. Present in a way that went beyond physical proximity. He taught Robert the names of things with the thoroughness of a man who understood that knowing the names of things gave you a relationship to them. He explained his thinking when he made decisions, even to a 2-year-old who was mostly interested in whether there was a horse nearby. Florence watched this and felt something that she had learned over the years was not a simple feeling. It was not just love, though it was love. It was something more like recognition, the recognition of a person becoming more fully themselves, growing into the spaces they had been afraid to occupy. The homestead claim was fulfilled in 1882, and the land was fully, permanently hers. She had met every requirement, made every improvement, and the county land office stamped the final documents with a satisfying authority. Florence stood in the office and held the papers and thought about Robert Turner, her first husband, and about the dream, and she felt something she could only describe as the carrying forward of something that deserved to be carried. She told Charles that night. He poured 2 glasses of the good bourbon he kept for significant occasions and handed her one and raised his in a toast. "To Florence Garrison," he said. "Florence Turner Garrison," she said. "Florence Turner Garrison," he agreed, with the particular warmth in his gray eyes that she had long since stopped trying to describe to herself, and had simply decided to receive with both hands. In the spring of 1883, Florence found herself expecting again. This time she told Charles within the week, partly because she had gotten over the habit of sitting with news alone. She had found, to her continuing mild surprise, that sharing things did not diminish them, and partly because the timing was complicated. She was in the middle of a particularly demanding spring planting season, and she needed to recalibrate several plans. Charles listened to all the recalibration without interruption. When she was done, he said, "What do you need from me?" It was, Florence had concluded, the best question a person could ask another person. She told him specifically, and he did exactly what she asked without modification or embellishment, which was also, she had concluded, a considerable virtue. Their daughter arrived in November of 1883, small and fierce, and possessed of an expression of indignant commentary from the first hours of her life. Florence looked at her and felt immediately that this child was going to be something to reckon with. They named her Margaret, which had been Florence's suggestion, made carefully. Charles had been very still when she said it. She had explained, "She was part of you, and that part of you is here now. That deserves to be honored, not hidden." He had looked at her for a long time with the expression she had never fully gotten used to, the expression of a man who continued to be surprised, even after years, by the degree to which being known was not dangerous. "Margaret," he had said. Yes. Margaret Garrison was, within 3 years, a force of nature in a pinafore, and the entire Harlan Creek community knew it. By 1885, Harlan Creek itself had grown considerably. There was a proper school now, and a doctor's office, and a second mercantile that had created a friendly commercial rivalry with the first one. The railroad had come within 12 miles of town, which transformed everything about how the cattle drives worked and significantly changed the economics of the region. Charles navigated the railroad's arrival with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, and the garrison operation adapted well better than most, because Charles had been quietly anticipating this change for 2 years and had made preparations that were now paying off. Florence had been part of those preparations, not in a ceremonial way, but in the real way of a person whose thinking and observations contributed substantively to the decisions being made. She had become, in ways she had not specifically planned but felt entirely right, a presence in the community beyond her land and her marriage. She organized the first lending library in Harlan Creek, using her father's books as the founding collection, and then soliciting donations with a persuasive persistence that most of the town's residents eventually surrendered to. She served on the school board. She was consulted, with increasing regularity, by newer families arriving in the territory, particularly women who had arrived alone or semi-alone, with claims and dreams and the particular fear of inadequacy that Florence recognized intimately. To these women, she said variations of the same thing: "You are more capable than you know. Accept help when it is genuinely offered and learn to distinguish genuine from conditional. Build something that is yours. The land does not care about your past, only about what you do with it now." Charles, hearing her say this once on their porch to a young widow from Missouri named Clara Hendricks, had looked at Florence with an expression that she had eventually translated, over several hours of intermittent consideration, as the expression of a man looking at someone who had become exactly who they were always meant to be. She asked him about it later. "Is that what that look was?" she asked. "When you were listening to me talk to Clara Hendricks?" "Something like that," he said. "Something like what specifically?" He was quiet for a moment, doing the careful work of finding words for things that did not come in words. "Watching you," he said slowly, "I keep thinking all the things that could have gone differently. You could have gone back to Ohio, or the winter could have." He stopped. "A lot of things could have happened that didn't happen, and you're here, and you're who you are." He looked at her. "That seems like something worth." He paused again. "I notice it, is what I mean." Florence looked at the man she had been married to for 5 years. The man whose silence she had once feared and now understood to be its own language, one she had become fluent in. The man who had stacked firewood at her door in the dark of a bitter winter morning, alone and unacknowledged, driven by something he had not known how to name and had expressed the only way he knew how: through action, through showing up, through the quiet and consistent declaration that her survival mattered. "I notice you noticing," she said. "For the record." He almost smiled. The full version was rare, and she had never lost her pleasure in it. "I know," he said. "The summer of 1886 brought drought and the particular anxiety of watching the sky for rain that did not come. Charles managed the herd through it with the careful stewardship of someone who had built something too important to lose to panic, making difficult decisions early enough to matter. Florence's wheat took a hard hit, but she had diversified over the years: chickens, a kitchen garden that she had expanded significantly, a small apple orchard she had started in 1882 that was just beginning to produce properly, and the diversification absorbed what the wheat lost. They got through it, as they had gotten through everything, together, with honesty about the difficulty, and without pretending the difficulty was less than it was. Young Robert, now 5 and deeply invested in every aspect of the cattle operation, developed an opinion about the drought management that he delivered to his father at breakfast with great seriousness. Charles listened to this opinion with the same attentiveness he gave to everyone he respected, and when it was over, told Robert specifically what was sound about his thinking, and specifically where his assumptions needed revision. Robert received this with the expression of a person filing information for future use. Florence watched this exchange and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing a pattern you know well appearing in a new iteration. In the autumn of 1887, something happened that Florence had not anticipated. Hiram Beck, who had never been her friend and who had made several additional attempts over the years to pressure the Turner Garrison properties through legal and semi-legal means, all of which had been methodically defeated, sent word that he was selling his operation and moving on. The letter was delivered to Charles, who brought it to Florence. They sat with it at the kitchen table. "He's offering us first right of purchase on the eastern quarter," Charles said. Florence looked at the letter. "That's the land that abuts my southern boundary." "Yes." She thought about November of 1879 when her fence posts had been pulled in the night. She thought about the fear of that winter, the vulnerability of a woman alone with a contested claim. "Buy it," she said. Charles looked at her, a small, particular expression. "We'll split it," Florence said. "Half to the ranch operation, half folded into the homestead claim. We can formally petition to expand the claim boundaries. It's been done. We'd be taking on debt for the purchase. We can service it. I've done the numbers." She said this with the confidence of someone who had, in fact, done the numbers and was not claiming she had done them when she hadn't. He knew that about her. He did not question it. "Then yes," he said. The purchase went through in January of 1888. Florence stood at the new boundary of her expanded land on a cold, clear January morning, almost exactly 9 years after the winter she had nearly not survived, and she looked out at the white expanse of it and felt something she could only describe as territorial in the most fundamental sense. This was hers. She had fought for it and worked it and proven herself to it and stayed when everything had suggested she should leave, and it had given itself back to her in kind. She heard Charles's horse behind her and turned. He rode up and stopped beside her, looking out at the same view. 9 years ago this month," she said, "someone stacked firewood at my door for the first time." He looked at the horizon, the particular quietness of a man sitting with a memory. "I was terrified you'd see me," he said, which was not something he had said before. Florence looked at him. "Truly, the first week, I almost stopped, thought she'll think it's strange, or worse." "What kept you going?" He looked at her then, the gray eyes with all their complication and all their depth. "I thought about you running out of wood in the middle of February," he said, "and I couldn't stand it." Florence felt the familiar warmth in her chest that was not just warmth but was, she had long since accepted, the particular feeling of being loved by this specific person in this specific quiet way that had shown itself not in words but in mornings. "Charles Garrison," she said, "you are the most roundabout romantic in the history of the frontier." "I know," he said, without apology, because Charles Garrison had arrived at a place in his life where he understood that the way he was enough. She rode back toward home beside him, across the land that was hers and his and theirs, under the January sky. Young Robert turned 7 in February of 1888 and developed an obsession with the apple orchard that delighted Florence and confused Charles, who had no particular feelings about apples either way and could not account for the level of attachment. Margaret, who was 4, had developed an absolute devotion to the horses that suggested a future spent in saddle rather than kitchen, which Florence privately thought was absolutely fine and said so. Life on the Garrison properties had a shape now, a rhythm built over years, comfortable not in the way of stagnation but in the way of a thing that has grown into itself. There were hard seasons and good ones. There were disputes and resolutions, losses and unexpected gains. There were mornings that were ordinary and mornings that were extraordinary for reasons as small as the particular quality of the light on the snow, or as large as a 7-year-old boy appearing in the kitchen with his boots on the wrong feet, holding an apple from last fall's harvest, announcing that he intended to grow the finest orchard in Kansas. There were evenings on the porch, summer and winter, when Florence and Charles sat together in the easy silence that was, by now, entirely different from the careful silences of their beginning. This was the silence of two people who had said the important things and were now simply occupying the same space with the particular pleasure of people who know where they belong. There were nights when the wind came across the plains, with a force that reminded you that the frontier was not domesticated, exactly, but only temporarily courteous. And those nights Florence would sometimes lie awake and think about the winter of 1879 with a clarity that never fully faded, because you do not forget the winters that tried to take you. And in those waking moments, Charles would stir beside her. He always seemed to know, even in sleep, when she was awake, and he would say nothing, because he rarely needed to. But he would reach over and take her hand and hold it with the same steadiness that had been present in everything he had ever done for her. And she would feel the particular safety of someone who has been thoroughly, consistently, and specifically known. In the spring of 1889, Florence discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Charles the same evening she was certain, because she had given up entirely on the habit of sitting with things alone when the alternative was telling him. He was not surprised, or if he was, the surprise was absorbed into a warm stillness that she recognized as his particular brand of joy. He brought her tea. He had gotten quite good at tea, which had taken years of practice and several strong opinions from Florence about the correct temperature. And he sat across from her at the table, and they talked about what it meant for the spring work and what it meant for everything else. And by the end of the evening, it was simply a part of the shape of the life they were building together, which was a life that kept growing in directions neither of them had specifically planned, and both of them had come to trust. Their second son, James Garrison, arrived in November of 1889, red-faced and enormous and immediately popular with both Robert, who regarded him as a fascinating new research subject, and Margaret, who decided within the first hour that he was her personal responsibility and took this seriously from that day forward. Florence held James in the November afternoon light and thought about Cincinnati, and about Robert Turner, and about covered wagons, and about typhoid, and about a morning in 1879 when she had opened her door and found wood stacked there as if by magic, as if the land itself had taken pity on her. The land had not taken pity on her. A man had. A silent, careful, complicated man who had not known how to say what he felt but had known, with absolute certainty, what he could do, and had done it every single morning for 3 months without asking for anything in return except, perhaps, the private knowledge that she was warm. Charles was standing at the window, looking out at the November afternoon, and she knew exactly what he was doing, the thing he did in significant moments, the careful and thorough attending to the world outside so that the world inside had room to be what it was. "Charles," she said. He turned. She held James out toward him, and he crossed the room and took the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before and the absolute attentiveness of a man who understood that this was not a thing to do casually. He held James and looked at him with the same expression she had seen when Robert was born, the expression that undid all the careful control, and Florence watched it and thought, there is the man who stacked the firewood, not hidden, not performing, just fully and finally himself. "Thank you," Charles said, and she was not sure whether he was speaking to James or to her or to something larger than either of them, and she decided it did not matter. "You're welcome," Florence said. "Now sit down before you start crying standing up." He made a sound that was close enough to a laugh that it counted. Harlan Creek continued to grow through the 1890s, and with it, the Garrison family. Robert became, as he had always clearly intended, involved in the land from the earliest possible age, and by the time he was 12 he had opinions about crop rotation that were not unreasonable. Margaret could outride most of the cowhands by the time she was 8, which Charles acknowledged with the stoic pride of a man who had expected nothing less. James was a different creature than his siblings, quieter, more observant, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and an interior life that was clearly complex and which he revealed on his own timeline. Florence continued everything she had built. The library grew into an actual building, donated by Charles as a gift to the town on the occasion of their 10th anniversary, in his name and hers both, with a small brass plate on the door that read Turner Garrison Community Library, which Florence considered one of the most aesthetically pleasing things she had ever seen. She sat on the school board for 12 years in total. She helped 7 different women in the community through the process of establishing and proving homestead claims. She kept meticulous accounts of the homestead operation and the joint ranch accounts both, and her records were, by general consensus, considerably more reliable than the county register. She grew older in the way of a woman who had done hard things and was not diminished by them, but was instead densified, more concentrated, more precisely herself, with less tolerance for dishonesty and less patience for the pretenses that people adopted to avoid saying true things, and a great deal more tenderness for the genuine vulnerability that all those pretenses were trying to protect. Charles aged beside her, the weathering of his face deepening, the gray at his temples spreading until it was most of what was there, and he became, if anything, quieter and more certain simultaneously. A man who had spent many years arriving at a settled understanding of what he believed and what he valued and who he was, and who now inhabited that understanding with a completeness that Florence found deeply peaceful to be near. They had, over the years, one significant argument, a proper one, not the small operational disagreements that were resolved within an hour, but an actual rupture that lasted 3 days, and concerned a decision about the ranch's expansion that Florence believed was reckless and Charles believed was necessary. She had been right about 2/3 of her concerns. He had been right about the necessity. They had repaired it the way they repaired everything, by talking until they had both said everything honest, and then continuing past the anger until what remained was understanding. He had told her at the end of it that he had forgotten, briefly, to bring her in on the decision properly before it was made, and that the forgetting had been not malicious but habitual, the habit of a man who had spent years making decisions alone, and that he was working to break the habit and would she continue to call him on it when he slipped. She had said yes. She had also said she was sorry for the particular sharpness of some of what she had said, which had been honest, but had been delivered without the care that honesty sometimes required. He had nodded and said the sharpness had been fair given the circumstances. She had said she knew, but fair and kind were not always the same thing, and she intended to be both. He had looked at her with that expression that she had long since stopped trying to fully describe and said simply, "You usually are." On the occasion of their 20th wedding anniversary, in June of 1900, Robert was 19 and already running a significant portion of the ranch operations with an ease and authority that made Charles look, Florence thought, like someone watching a future arrive that he had prepared for carefully, and was now glad to see. Margaret was 16 and had developed, in addition to her horsemanship, a talent for argument so finely honed that she frequently had Charles looking to Florence for backup, which Florence rarely provided because Margaret was usually at least partially right. James was 10 and had recently decided that his primary interest was mathematics, a decision that Florence supported entirely, and Charles regarded with the fond confusion of a man who had never been naturally mathematical but understood its value. They celebrated the anniversary with a dinner at the ranch house that included the Dawes family. Millie had married the new doctor in 1885, in what everyone agreed was a perfect pairing of a woman who shared information freely and a man who needed to know everything. And the Denton family and several of the families they had known the longest and best. After the dinner, after the children had been dispatched to various activities, and the guests had gone home full of good food and wine, Florence and Charles sat on the porch in the June night and watched the stars. 20 years, Florence said. Charles said. When you were stacking firewood at my door in November of 1879, Florence said, did you have any notion at all that it would come to this? He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of serious consideration. No, he said. I thought he paused. I thought I was just doing what needed doing. I didn't let myself think past it. But you kept doing it. Yes, every morning. Yes. Florence looked at the stars. I used to try to figure out what it meant, she said. Before I knew it was you, I used to have these long arguments with myself about what it might mean and whether I should let myself hope it meant something good. Did you? He said softly. I did. She smiled at the stars. You terrified me when I found out it was you, not because I thought you were dangerous, but because I had already started to feel something, and finding out it was you made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had on that February morning 6 months into the winter when everything had changed. I was terrified too, he said. Every morning I put the wood down, I thought, this is the day she'll come out and see me and it will be strange and I'll have ruined the whole thing. And instead I came out and invited you in for biscuits. The bravest thing anyone had ever done for me, he said, with a quiet sincerity that was entirely characteristic and entirely not joking. Florence turned to look at him. The man she had known for 21 years and been married to for 20. The man whose silences she understood, and whose words she treasured, and whose steadiness had been the ground under her feet through everything hard and everything good. The man who had shown her, long before she understood it, that love was not always a declaration. Sometimes it was firewood stacked in the dark before anyone was awake, offered freely, without conditions, as simply and as profoundly as saying, "You matter and your survival matters and I am here." Charles Garrison, she said. He looked at her. I'm very glad you did not stop after the first week. Something moved across his face, warmth and humor and the love that had always been too large for the words he had available, expressing itself, as it always had, in the quietest possible way. So am I, he said. The Kansas night was warm and full of stars, and the faint sound of the prairie in summer, that rustling, breathing, living sound that Florence had first heard in 1879 with terror, and had come to hear now as something closer to a welcome. The land that had tested her had also kept her. The winter that had tried to defeat her had also given her this. The wood stacked at the door, the gray eyes across a breakfast table, the man beside her now who had never stopped showing up. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. The stars continued their old, indifferent revolution, and below them, on a porch on the Kansas plains, two people who had found each other in the middle of a bitter winter sat together in the long summer night, warm and not alone and home.